Dr. Rob Nicholls is an Associate Professor in Regulation and Governance at the University of New South Wales Business School and is a visiting professional fellow at the UTS Sydney Law. He had a 30-year career concentrating on competition, regulation and governance, and spent a considerable time in industry prior to moving to academia. I can say so much more about Rob, but I will pass on to you, Rob, and allow you to introduce yourself and your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Roba, and I won't add to that very long introduction, so thanks very much. I will start off with a comment, though, that I really liked Katina's comment on Lindsay's presentation as being surfacing common sense. I'd have to say my experience is that common sense is remarkably uncommon, and I think Lindsay's approach was really useful. And so today what I'd like to do is have a discussion, but actually it's to throw out a series of questions, because I promised Katina, well, I'll look at this issue, this internet access as a point of security. And then when I started to look at it, I found, well, there are all these really interesting questions which I was unable to answer quickly. So I'm going to actually throw some of this back as questions. So what I'm going to do is essentially run through, firstly, why am I talking about internet access? I mean, how is this important for security? And particularly, how is it important for personal welfare? And then I'm going to suggest there are three ways of looking at internet access. The one which, frankly, we all assume almost all of the time is, well, it's a necessity. How could we be on these fabulous Zoom calls if we didn't have internet access? How could I have texted Katina to say, oh, I've lost the Zoom link for this session. Please, could you send it to me again? So I sent it by messenger and she sent it back by email. These are all the assumptions as to the way that the internet works and assumptions as to the access to the internet that we have. I'm going to also have a look at internet access potentially as a luxury. And I'm going to suggest that there are some issues where parts of internet access look like a luxury in some regards, but it raises a particular problem of a very big one of what is the internet. So if I can't have access to the dark web, is that problematic? Am I being deprived of access? If I can have access to only domains which end .gov or .gov.au or .govt.nz, is that a problem? I'm going to suggest that illegal protest, which was my third limb, is actually problematic. And it raises some of the issues in terms of transdisciplinary response, which I'll end up with. I particularly like Lewis's comment about using inappropriate three-letter acronyms or getting confused with three-letter acronyms. I'm going to suggest that actually this is particularly problematic in taking a transdisciplinary approach to internet access. So why am I talking about this? Well, on a global basis, internet access is not universal. So we have, on a global basis, a significant proportion of the population of the globe who have smartphones. And why am I talking about smartphones? Well, because in many parts of the globe, a fixed line access just doesn't exist. So internet access for the vast majority of people around the world is not some fiber to somewhere deep in the local access network. It's a mobile device. And the proportion of people with smartphones, as I'll show using some statistics from the the GSMA, which is the body for the carriers, the people who actually provide services that use these smartphones, that 75% is probably being terribly optimistic anyway, because many of the people who have a smartphone won't actually have a service which will allow them to get internet access using that smartphone. There's a historical thing which says that internet access is further from universality in countries with lower GDP per capita. More recent statistics, and that was certainly the case up until 10 years ago, more recent statistics suggest that actually there is a gap, but it's not quite the universality. It's actually the ability to shift between universal coverage and universal access. And I'm going to argue that this is a key distinction. I'm also going to suggest that actually, if anybody who's on this session is providing input into policy matters, there's almost certainly an assumption if you're providing input into an OECD country's policy or a country with a reasonably high GDP per capita, well, internet access, of course, everybody's got access to the internet. How could we deliver services unless there's internet access? And I'm going to argue that that is problematic because that problematic issue arises from assumptions where engineering and other disciplines actually differ in what they mean. That is, that a transdisciplinary approach is required, and part of that transdisciplinary approach is actually a little bit of interpretation. What do we mean by access and coverage? So I'm going to go back to look at internet access as a necessity. And I'm sitting in Sydney, so I'm going to use Australia as an example. Now, in 2014, so that's 8 years ago, the data was collected less than 7 years after the launch of the iPhone. 95% of homeless people had a phone. 74% of homeless people had a smartphone. Why? Well, actually, the support that was provided to homeless people, and it doesn't matter whether it's state support or charity support, recognize that to be able to provide the levels of support that were actually required meant that internet access was a necessity for people who were homeless. So how do you shift from being in a position of homelessness to having at least less tenuous living arrangements? Well, you need to be able to provide to get access to services. And in the main, those services are delivered over the internet, so access is required. The proportion in the United States is lower, but it's still significant that actually a smartphone is a necessity to a marginalized group of the community. And in this case, I'm taking the marginalized group being homeless people. I've mentioned this assumption of internet access, and in most OECD countries, yes, there's 95% of the population have internet access. That is, they have a device, whether it's a phone device or a home-based device, that provides access to the internet, and therefore they can get access to government-provided services and other services. But there's a chunk. There's 5% of the population which doesn't have that access. And that becomes really important because it creates a digital divide which is often assumed away. Oh, well, we don't need to worry about a digital divide in terms of internet access because there's broadband mobile coverage everywhere where people live. The penetration of smartphones is really high. So there's no reason why we should actually look at the group of people who don't have access to the internet. And I chose the word necessity partly to try and make this next point, which is that if internet access is a necessity, I've avoided using the word essential. Why do I avoid using the word essential? Because an essential service or an essential facility has a very different meaning in terms of either infrastructure or utilities regulation, or a legal approach to that service. So even the language that we might use to describe something as being terribly important to the extent that there really is no option to not have it, using words like necessary, distinct from essential, becomes an important issue. Now, I've mentioned there's a bit of a gap. So this bit of a gap has been closed significantly. So this is the GSMA, as I said, this is the body which represents the interests of carriers or network operators. They've argued that this year, up to this year, huge investments between 2012 and 2022, the coverage gap for mobile networks has changed, and only 6% of the global population doesn't have mobile broadband coverage. But there's a usage gap, a very big usage gap. So instead of there only being 6% of people around the globe who don't have access to the internet, the actual answer, well, last year was 3.2 billion people. That's a lot. That's 40+% of the global population. So although we can start to say, well, there is 94% access to mobile broadband networks, and we might start to build policy assumptions on that 94% coverage. If access is distinct from coverage, and actually, what's the coverage? Well, a little bit under 60%. That's a very different environment. And part of the reason for raising this gap is, again, to emphasize the need for using a common language. I'm only going to look briefly at luxury, and this is the first issue is typically an approach which is taken by economists. Now, I have to say, some of my best friends are economists, but when we're using the internet, are we being productive? Oh, clearly, now we're in this fabulous session, we're all learning great things, and this is a productive use of the internet. And when I finish this session and switch over to TikToks to watch cat videos, I've still not worked out how to monetize my cats. Is that being productive? If I had monetized my cats, would that be being productive? Is access to the metaverse an essential or a luxury? And why is access to the internet different? And probably the thing that becomes quite problematic is an issue called net neutrality. So this is, should I be able to, or should the user be able to get all parts of the internet available on a particular basis, or only some of it? So you had, particularly back in 2016, a fabulous offer from Mark Zuckerberg, which was to provide universal free access to the internet in India. But the universal free access was to that part of the internet run by members of internet.org, which included Facebook, shockingly, but didn't actually cover the rest of what we would consider the internet, that is, stuff that Google indexes, and certainly didn't look at issues like the dark web. So if you have a free tier to provide internet access, is that universality? Is that true internet access? Or is it actually, well, you have access to the services that, that we provide? And I think that this sort of fits in with Lindsay's comment of lack of segregation. So the same issues arise in different places. And net neutrality has been a significant issue in developed countries as well, but providing a differentiated, you haven't got the disposable income per capita, so you get Facebook. Well, no, that's not true. It's Facebook and Insta and WhatsApp and other meta properties. But if you want access to the internet, you have to be rich enough to be able to afford it. So actually the issue here is that the creation of internet access as a luxury essentially for commercial needs. Now, my final area is illegal protest, and I'm going to have a look here at, well, what is protest and what's real. And everybody's seen this cartoon before, but it's the one that I really like, where yes, there is something odd about information on the internet. And it becomes a multidisciplinary issue. So this is, I haven't redacted this, although it links entirely into Lindsay's redacted comments. Internet shutdowns, that is the denial of internet access by a state, becomes an international relations issue. So what element of the US government is making a statement on internet shutdown? Well, it's state. So it is a full-on diplomatic international relations issue. If there was an internet shutdown which limited access to certain services, and I'm going to give an example here. So Facebook cutting off access to 1-800-RESPECT, which is an anti-domestic violence service in Australia, does that become an international relations issue, or is it just a commercial issue? There are protections in the US which are specific to, specific to the US, which is the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. And what does that do? Well, it says that any internet service provider that essentially does not moderate speech on its services is protected because it's not a publisher. So from, in this case, Electronic Frontiers, Section 230, the most important law protecting internet speech. Or is it why hate speech is a never-ending problem on the internet? So different approaches to the way that we deal with not just internet access, but what is accessed over the internet lead to quite distinct outcomes which looked very different in different jurisdictions. So this morning in Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has said there are significant harms arising from platforms on the internet, And my former colleague, the chair of the ACCC, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, is calling for a change in the law. And the response that will come back from Facebook and Google is, well, we can't be responsible because we're protected by the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which you are in the US, but you're not in Australia, and you're not in New Zealand, and you're not in Hong Kong. So that there is an issue which, from social implications of technology approach, needs to start to say, well, where can we look at universality, and where are we stuck simply looking at the domestic jurisdiction in which we operate? So I'm going to suggest there needs to be a transdisciplinary response to even just the thinking about the issue of internet access. It's a socio-technical issue. It's a socio-technical issue using the excellent description that Roba gave us earlier on today. One of the problems with issues which are socio-technical issues is different languages. So people mean different things depending on the disciplines that they come from. Creating a common language, now the first thing we need to do is write the dictionary, is probably an important part of getting a commonality across disciplines to be able to address socio-technical issues. An example is that universal service and universal access are different. I can provide telecommunications services to 99% of the population, but if only 50% of the population can actually use it, there's a gap. Access to the internet is not just access to Meta or indeed to Google. A really important issue which comes up in the policy environment is that the delivery of e-government services depends on access. It doesn't drive it of itself. And this, I think, is one of the learnings that flows from the very rapid deployment of different e-government services during the first part of the pandemic. And the last one is a hobby horse one for me, which is that misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation require a transdisciplinary response. Understanding what is misinformation and what is malinformation requires an analysis which is not a purely technical analysis. It's not a purely psycholinguistic analysis. It can draw on narrative theory. It can draw on different things. And this, in the context of internet access, is really important. And that's it. That's all I have to say, and very happy to have a discussion and to try and answer any questions which are merely trying to address the questions that I've tried to raise.